everyone, I hope you're doing well today. We are going to review those questions from the last chapter, which would be the end of chapter 3 or Serafina part C. So the first question is, what was the name of Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew, and did Serafina recognize him? So we figure out the name of Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew on page 40. It simply just says that I am Braden, he said, and then Serafina replied with her name, and then she was upset because she's like, oh, her father said don't let anyone see you, and now he has a name and a face. So she was upset. And it says, did she recognize him? We know that it's Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew because if you hop back a page on page 38, where the little boy, Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew, asked her if she was lost, she said, "It's all right." As he stepped towards her, I still get lost sometimes here too. So that's him talking to her. Serafina sucked in a breath, and suddenly she realized that she was speaking face to face with the young master, Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew. So that obviously right there tells us that it's Mr. Vanderbilt. Also, I like how it tells us about him earlier in our book, because if you go all the way back in our text to page 12, she was curious, like she wanted to know what this moment in her life would be like. I don't think she expected it to happen at that moment, but that is what happened. Because it says that she, lately, she had been wondering just what would happen if they did. And that is talking about like what would happen if someone did find her. What if the boy glimpsed her? What would she do? What if his dog chased her? Could she get up a tree in time? Sometimes I'd like to imagine what it would be like to say if she met Mrs. Vanderbilt face to face. So she's imagining those people, and she's seen those people. So she definitely, as soon as he looked at her, boom, she recognized him. All right, now number 2. It says, what is the name of the little girl in the yellow dress? If you go to page 42, at the very, very top, it says, Miss Brams, Mr. Bosman said, turning towards her in disturbance. Has anyone seen my Clara? Miss Brams cried frantically, reaching out and grabbing the people around her. Please help me. She's gone, missing. I can't find her anywhere. And the more that you read down, Serafina says, well, that must be her, the girl who I saw in the yellow dress. So we figure out that is, or it says Miss Claire Brams. Serafina thought that's the girl in the yellow dress. So there we go. And the last question is, why did Serafina run away at the end? Well, if you look on page 140, or not one, on page 43, it says that it is, let me relook and see who was talking. He approached. I want to say Mr. Vanderbilt. He is the one talking at this time. And he says, we'll break up into 5 separate parties, he explained. We'll search the entire house, all 4 floors, and also the basement. If anyone finds anything suspicious, report it immediately. So Serafina rips her arm away from Mr. Bosman, who is holding onto Serafina, and she has to go, and it says the leftovers from last dinner's night, the mattress that she sleeps on, they had to hide it all. So she went to go hide all of her things. Okay, we are going to go ahead and start on chapter 4. I am going to go back, since we just answered that last question, that kind of let us know where we were at. They are starting a search party for Clara, and Serafina has ran away so she can go clean up the mess in the basement. All right, starting on page 45, we're on chapter 4. Here we go. Serafina rushed up to her father in the workshop and grabbed his arm, trying to talk and catch her breath at the same time. She gasped, "Pa, there's a girl missing, just like I said, and Mr. Vanderbilt's searching the whole house." Her words tumbled out with a mixture of urgency and pride. As she hurriedly reminded him what it was like that she had seen the night before, she was sure that he had now seen that she wasn't dreaming or making up stories. "They're searching the house?" he asked, ignoring everything else. He turned and quickly gathered his cooking supplies, a razor from the bench, and then dragged her mattress into a hidden area he constructed behind the tool rack. There could be no evidence of their living there. when the search party came through. "What about the girl I saw disappear?" she asked in confusion. She couldn't figure out why he wasn't more interested in than what she was telling him. "Children don't just disappear, Sarah," he said as he continued his efforts. Her heart sank. He still didn't believe her. Her pa looked around the room one last time to make sure he hadn't missed anything, and then he looked at her. For a moment, she thought he was finally going to listen to what she was saying, but then he pointed at her hairbrush and snapped, "For God's sakes, girl, pick up your things." "But what about the man in the black cloak?" she argued. "I don't want you thinking about anything like that," he barked. "It's nothing but a nightmare. Now hush up." She flinched from the words. She couldn't understand why he was being so mean. But she could hear the words in his voice, along with the anger, and in the distance she could hear the search party coming down the stairs. She knew it wasn't just a threat of discovery that scared him. He hated any talk of the supernatural or any sort of dark and fiendish forces out in the world that he couldn't fix with wrenches, hammers, and screwdrivers. "But it's real," she demanded. "The girl's actually gone, Pa. I'm telling the truth. A little girl's gotten herself lost, that's it, and they're looking for her, so they'll find her wherever she is. Get your wits about you. People don't just vanish. She's got to be someplace." She stood in the center of the room. "I think we should both go out there right now and tell them everything I saw," she declared boldly. "No, Sarah," he said. "They'll spit nails if they find me living down here. They'll fire me. Do you understand that? And God knows that they'll make of you. They don't even know you're alive, and we're going to keep it that way. I'm talking to you dead straight now, girl. You hear me?" The sound of the search party could be heard down from the corridor, and it was coming their way. Clenching her teeth, she shook her paw in frustration and stood before him. "Why, Pa? Why? Why can't people see me?" She didn't have the courage to tell him that at least one Vanderbilt already had, and that he knew her name. "Just tell me, Pa. Whatever it is, I'm 12 years old, I'm grown up, and I deserve to know." "Look, Sarah," he said, "last night somebody sabotaged the dynamo. Did some real damage that I'm not sure I can mend. If I don't get it fixed by nightfall, there's going to be a lot to pay from the boss, and rightly so. The ladders, the elevators, the servant call system, this whole place depends on the Edison machine." She tried to imagine someone sneaking into the electrical room and damaging the equipment. But why would someone do that, Pa? The search party was making its way through the kitchen, and it would arrive in the workshop at any moment. "I ain't got time to think about it," he said, moving towards her with his huge body. "I just got to get working, that's all. Now, do what I tell you." He charged around the room and hit all the things with such roughness and loudness and violence that it frightened her. She crept behind the boiler and watched him. She knew that when he was like this, she couldn't get anywhere with him. He just wanted to be left alone and do his job and work on his machines. But it was gnawing at her, and the more she thought about it, the madder she got. She knew it wasn't the right time to talk to him about everything that she had been thinking and feeling, but she didn't care. She just blurted it out. "I'm sorry, Pa," she said. "I know you're busy, but please just tell me why you don't want anyone to see me." She stepped out from behind the boiler and faced him, her voice getting louder. "Have you been hiding me all of these years?" she demanded. "Just tell me what's wrong with me. I want to know. Why are you ashamed of me?" By the time that she was done, she was practically screaming at him. Her voice was so loud and shrill that it actually echoed. Her paw stopped dead in his tracks and looked at her. She knew she had finally reached him down inside and grabbed that armored heart of his. She had finally stirred him up. She felt a sudden impulse to take it all back and dart behind the boiler. Again, to hide behind the boiler, again to hide. But she didn't. She stood before him and looked at him as steadily as she could, with her eyes watering. He stood very still over by the bench, his huge hands balled into fists. A visible wave of pain and despair seemed to pass through him all at once, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "I'm not ashamed of you," he said gruffly, his voice strangely hoarse. The searchers were now only one room away. "You are," she shot back. She was trembling in fear, but she wasn't going to give up this time. She wanted to shake him. She wanted to shake him to the core. "You're ashamed of me," she said again. He turned away from her so that she couldn't see his face, just the back of his head and huge, bulky body. Several seconds of silence went by. Then he shook his head like he was arguing with himself, or furious with her, or both. She wasn't sure. "Just keep your mouth shut and follow me," he said as he turned and walked out of the room. Scurrying after him, she caught up with him in the corridor. Her body felt queasy all over. She didn't know where he was taking her or what was going to happen. She could barely suck in breaths that led her down the narrow stone stairs to the sub-basement and into the electrical room with an iron dynamo and the thick black wires that spired up the wall. She had felt the search party behind them at least for a little while. "We'll hole up in here," he said, as he pulled the door shut with heavy thud and locked them in. As he lit the lantern against the darkness, she never seen him look so serious, so grave and pale, and it frightened her. "What's happening, Pa?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Sit down," he said. "Ya ain't gonna like what I got to tell you, but it might help you understand." Serafina swallowed, sat on an old wooden spool of copper wire, and prepared herself to listen. Her Pa sat down on the floor facing her, with his back against the wall, staring down at the floor and deep in thought. He began to talk. "Years ago, I was working as a mechanic in a train yard in Asheville," he said. "The foreman and his wife had just had their third baby, and their home was full of joy. But while everyone else celebrated, I sat alone in a kind of self-made misery. I ain't proud of it, the way I was sopping around that night, but things just weren't working out for me the way that they were supposed to in a man's life. I wanted to meet a good woman, build a house in town, and have children of my own. The years had gone by, and it hadn't happened. I was a big man, but not much to look at. I sweated all day on the engines, and those few times I encountered any women folk, I could never find my words. I could talk about nuts and bolts till the morning come, but not much else." She opened her mouth to ask a question, but she didn't want to disrupt the story that was finally pouring out of her Pa. "That night, while everyone was tipping the jug," he continued, "I was feeling pretty poor, and I headed out. I went for a long walk, just walking like you walk when you got much on your mind and to do naught else. I was deep into the forest, up through the river gap, and into the mountains. When night came, I just kept walking. It was hard for her to picture her father traveling through the forest. All those times that he had warned her had led her to believe that she was never to set foot in the forest, that he hated the forest. At least he did now. "Were you scared, Pa?" "Nah, I weren't," he said, shaking his head, still looking at the floor. "But I should have been." "Why? What happened?" She couldn't even imagine what it was. The flicker of the lantern cast an eerie shadow on his face. She had always loved his stories, but this one felt closer to his heart than any story he had ever told. "I was walking through the woods, and I heard a queer howling noise, like an animal in terrible withering pain. The brushes were moving something fierce, but I couldn't quite make out what it was." "Was it something dying, Pa?" She leaned towards him. "I don't think so," he said, looking up at her. The ruckus in the bushes went on for a spell. Then the noise stopped all of a sudden. I thought it was over, but then a pair of greenish-yellow eyes peered at me from the darkness. Whatever sort of man or beast it was, it circled slowly around me, taking one position then another, setting me real careful, like it was trying to make a decision about me, whether I was worth eating or just letting be. I sensed a real power behind those eyes. But then the eyes disappeared. The beast was gone, and I heard a strange mewling, crying sound. She straightened her back and looked at him. Crying? She asked in confusion. That definitely wasn't what she was expecting. I searched through the bushes. Blood covered the ground, and in a blood lay a pile of small creatures. 3 of them were dead, but one of them remained just barely alive. She got off her wooden spool and crouched down beside her paw. She stared at him, totally absorbed in his story. In her mind, she could see the bloody creature on the ground. But what kind of creatures were they? She asked in amazement. He shook his head. Like everyone else who lives in these mountains, I'd heard the stories of black magic, but I never gave them such credit until that night. I studied one that was still alive the best I could in the darkness, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong, what kind of thing it was. Or more like my mind just couldn't believe it. But when I finally took up the creature in my bare hands and held it, I realized that it was actually a tiny human baby curled up in a little ball. Serafina's eyes widened in surprise. What? Wait, I don't understand. What happened? How did the baby get there? The same question was running through my own mind. Believe me, but one thing I knew for certain, regardless of how she came into the world, I had to get this baby some help. I bundled her up in my jacket, hiked back down the hill, and carried her out of the woods. I took her to the midwives at the convent, and I begged them to help. But they gasped at the sight of her, muttering that she was of the devil's work. They said that she was malformed, near to death, and that there was nothing they could do to help her. And that is where we are stopping for today. Thanks for listening.